Hello there and welcome. Tonight's gentle journey explores perhaps the most intimate mystery we carry within us, the soul, that sense of something deeper, something that feels like the real you beneath all the thoughts, emotions, and endless chatter of daily life. It's that quiet presence that seems to watch your dreams unfold, that feels somehow separate from yet intimately connected to your breathing body, your beating heart, your thinking mind. Before we drift into this contemplative exploration together, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what draws you to wonder about the nature of the soul. Are you tucked into bed somewhere in the countryside, watching shadows dance on the ceiling? Perhaps you're in a bustling city, finding peace amid the distant hum of traffic and life continuing beyond your window. Or maybe you're somewhere in between, in that quiet suburban twilight, where the day's responsibilities finally release their grip and allow space for deeper questions to emerge. What time is it in your corner of the world right now? Fitting, isn't it, that we begin this exploration of the soul's timeless mystery, anchored to our own particular moment in the endless flow of nights and days. Here we are, scattered across time zones and continents, yet somehow gathered in this shared space of wonder, each of us arriving at this very instant with our own unique relationship to that ineffable something we call soul. Now, I do hope this exploration isn't so intriguing that it keeps you awake when rest is what you're seeking. But if it does spark that gentle kind of insomnia, where thoughts drift like clouds across a peaceful sky, well, at least you'll have spent the time contemplating one of humanity's most enduring and beautiful mysteries. There are worse ways to pass the quiet hours than pondering the nature of your own deepest being. So settle in now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow your thoughts to soften around the edges like watercolors bleeding gently into damp paper. We're about to embark on a journey that has occupied human hearts and minds for millennia, one that touches the very core of what it means to be conscious, to be alive, to be you. Some find this exploration deeply comforting, others find it mysteriously unsettling, and many discover it's somehow both at once. The soul, if such a thing exists, remains perhaps the most intimate mystery we carry. Unlike other philosophical puzzles we might ponder from a comfortable distance, questions about the soul feel personal, immediate, inescapably close to home. When we ask what is the soul, we're really asking who are you? What are you? Why do you feel like someone rather than no one at all? These questions don't just tickle the intellect. They touch something deeper, that place where thinking meets being, where wonder meets the wanderer. Tonight we'll wander through ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience, through mystical experiences and everyday consciousness, through the ways different cultures have tried to name and understand this persistent human intuition that we are more than mere flesh and chemistry. We'll explore what happens when we turn attention inward, what meditation traditions have discovered about the nature of awareness itself, and what contemporary science might tell us about consciousness and its mysteries. But mostly we'll rest in the question itself, allowing it to open up space for reflection rather than rushing toward premature answers. Because perhaps the soul, whatever it might be, reveals itself not to grasping analysis, but to patient, gentle attention. Perhaps it's found not in the conclusions we reach, but in the quality of wondering itself, in that peculiar human capacity to be curious about our own being. So breathe deeply now, and let's begin this quiet journey together. Somewhere between sleeping and waking, between knowing and not knowing, between the you that thinks about the soul and the you that might just be soul thinking about itself, lies tonight's gentle exploration. Welcome to this peaceful inquiry into what might be the deepest mystery of all, the mystery of you. Every culture throughout human history has wrestled with this profound question. What makes you distinctly, irreducibly you? It's a question that seems to arise naturally from the human condition itself, emerging wherever people pause long enough to wonder about the nature of their own existence. The ways different societies have answered this question reveal both the universality of the soul's mystery and the beautiful diversity of human attempts to understand it. The ancient Egyptians developed perhaps one of the most elaborate concepts of the soul, believing it consisted of multiple interconnected parts rather than a single unified entity. They spoke of the Ka, a kind of life force that could survive physical death and required food offerings from the living. There was the Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, capable of traveling between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Akar represented the transfigured soul that had successfully navigated the afterlife journey, and the Ren was the secret name that contained the essence of a person's identity. This multifaceted understanding suggests they intuited that whatever we call soul might be far more complex than a simple singular thing. Greek philosophy gave us words we still use today when discussing the soul. Psyche originally meant breath or life, that animating principle that distinguished the living from the dead. But as Greek thought evolved, psyche came to encompass mind, soul, and the very essence of personality. Plato imagined the soul as tripartite, reason residing in the head, spirit in the chest, and appetite in the belly. Aristotle took a more biological approach, seeing the soul as the form or organizing principle of living beings. For him, even plants had souls of a sort, though different in complexity from animal or human souls. Hindu traditions speak of the Atman, often translated as the individual soul or self, which they consider to be identical with Brahman, the universal consciousness or ultimate reality. This perspective suggests that what we experience as our individual soul is actually a temporary manifestation of something much vaster, like waves arising from and returning to the ocean. The Upanishads describe this with beautiful metaphors. The Atman is like space in a jar that seems separate from the space outside, but is ultimately one with all space when the jar is broken. Buddhist teachings take a fascinating approach by questioning whether there's a permanent, unchanging soul at all. The doctrine of anatta, or non-self, suggests that what we think of as a fixed soul is actually a constantly changing process, a stream of consciousness flowing moment by moment without any permanent essence. Yet even as Buddhism denies the existence of a permanent self, it acknowledges the continuity of this process across lifetimes through the law of karma, creating what some scholars call a middle way between eternalism and nihilism. Indigenous traditions around the world often understand the soul as fundamentally connected to the land, to ancestors, to the web of all living beings. Many Native American traditions speak of souls that are intimately woven into the fabric of nature itself. Aboriginal Australians describe the soul as connected to the dream time, that eternal realm where ancestral spirits shaped the landscape and continue to influence the present. These traditions rarely see the soul as something contained within the individual, but rather as something that connects the individual to everything else. In the Jewish tradition, the soul, or neshama, is understood as the divine breath blown into Adam, making humans unique among creatures in carrying a spark of the divine within them. Christian theology developed complex understandings of the soul's relationship to the body, debating whether the soul pre-exists the body, is created at conception, or emerges from the body. Islamic teachings describe the soul, or ruh, as a divine mystery, with the Quran stating that the soul is from the command of Allah and that human knowledge of it is limited. Despite these vastly different theological and philosophical frameworks, striking similarities emerge across cultures. Nearly all traditions recognize some aspect of human experience that feels deeper than mere physical existence. Most acknowledge a sense of continuity that persists through life's changes. Many describe experiences of connection to something greater than individual identity, and most grapple with questions about what, if anything, survives bodily death. What's remarkable is that this intuition about the soul's existence doesn't seem to depend on religious teaching or philosophical education. Children often speak naturally about their inner lives in ways that suggest an innate sense of being more than just their bodies. People who've never encountered formal spiritual traditions often report experiences that feel soulful, moments of profound connection, creativity that seems to arise from beyond their ordinary thinking, or encounters with beauty that touch something deeper than emotion. This universality suggests something profound about human experience itself. Whether we interpret it as evidence for the soul's literal existence, or as pointing to important features of consciousness and identity, the widespread human sense of having or being a soul appears to emerge from the basic structure of subjective experience. We seem to be the kind of beings who naturally wonder about their own being, who experience themselves as both embodied and somehow transcendent, both individual and connected to something larger. So as we begin this exploration together, we're joining a conversation that has been going on for as long as humans have been human, adding our own quiet voices to this ancient inquiry into the nature of our deepest selves. Close your eyes for a moment, if you feel comfortable doing so, and notice something quite extraordinary that's been with you your entire life, yet rarely receives direct attention. There's a sense of being you that exists quietly beneath all the mental chatter, beneath the emotions that come and go like weather, beneath even the physical sensations that continuously arise and fade in your body. It's not your thoughts about yourself, which change constantly throughout the day. It's not your feelings, which shift with circumstances and hormones, and the quality of light streaming through your window. It's something more subtle, more constant, more intimate than any of these surface movements of experience. This felt sense of being you has been remarkably consistent throughout your life. The person who remembers being 5 years old, scared on the first day of school, is somehow the same person who worried about teenage heartbreak, who celebrated adult achievements, who lies here now listening to these words in the darkness. Your body has completely replaced itself multiple times over the years. Scientists tell us that most of our cells regenerate on cycles ranging from days to years, with some estimates suggesting that nearly every cell in your body is different from those you had 7 years ago. Your thoughts have changed dramatically since childhood. Your emotions have matured and evolved. Your beliefs, values, and perspectives have shifted, sometimes gradually, sometimes in sudden revelations that reorganized everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. Yet something has remained constant through all these changes. There's a continuity of experience, a thread of identity that weaves through all the transformations. When you remember your childhood, you don't feel like you're remembering someone else's life, even though that child's body, thoughts, and emotions were vastly different from yours today. Something in you recognizes that child as you, claims ownership of those memories, maintains an unbroken sense of being the same conscious being who has simply lived through many changes. This persistence of identity through change points to something mysterious about the nature of consciousness itself. What exactly maintains continuity when everything else is in flux? Memory plays a role, certainly, but memory is notoriously unreliable and constantly being reconstructed. You can't remember most of your life in detail, yet you don't feel like you've ceased to exist during all those forgotten moments. You don't doubt your identity when you wake up each morning, despite having been unconscious for hours. Despite your brain having gone through complex cycles of neural activity that don't include your normal waking sense of self. Even more puzzling, this sense of being you appears to have no clear location. When you search for where you feel most yourself, you might initially point to your head, where your eyes look out and your thoughts seem to arise. But closer examination reveals something strange. You don't feel like you're located behind your eyes, exactly. You don't feel squeezed into your skull like a person sitting in a tiny cockpit operating a body-shaped machine. The sense of self seems somehow distributed, pervading your entire embodied experience, while simultaneously feeling like it transcends physical location altogether. This quality of selfhood also seems to exist at a different level from the contents of consciousness. Your thoughts arise and pass away. You can observe them coming and going like clouds drifting across an empty sky. Your emotions surge and recede like waves on a shore. Sensations appear and disappear throughout your body. But the awareness that notices all these changes seems remarkably stable. It's as if there's a still center that remains unchanged while everything else moves around it, through it, within it. Meditation traditions have explored this phenomenon for thousands of years, developing precise methods for investigating the nature of awareness itself. They often describe discovering a witnessing consciousness that seems separate from the witnessed contents of experience. This witness awareness doesn't get caught up in the drama of thoughts and emotions. It simply observes, spaciously and peacefully, as the ever-changing contents of experience unfold within it. Some traditions call this the true self, while others are careful to avoid labeling it at all, preferring to point toward it through metaphor and direct experience. But this witness consciousness presents its own puzzles. What is it, exactly, that's doing the witnessing? When you observe your thoughts, what is the observer? When you notice emotions arising and passing, what notices? This leads to an infinite regress problem. If there's an observer watching the contents of consciousness, what observes the observer? And what observes the observer of the observer? Either this regress continues infinitely, which seems unlikely, or at some point observer and observed collapse into a single unified field of awareness. The felt sense of being you also includes something that might be called presence. You don't just exist. You feel present, here, now, in this moment. This presentness has an immediacy and intimacy that distinguishes it from everything else in your experience. Objects appear in your awareness, but you don't feel like an object to yourself. Thoughts arise in your mind, but you don't feel like a thought. Emotions move through you, but you don't feel like an emotion. There's something irreducibly subjective about your experience of being you, something that can never be fully captured from an outside perspective or reduced to objective description. This subjectivity is perhaps what philosophers mean when they talk about the first-person perspective being irreducible to third-person accounts. No matter how much someone else knows about your brain, your behavior, your history, and your circumstances, they can never access what it feels like to be you from the inside. That quality of inner experience, that sense of what philosophers call qualia, seems to belong to a different category of reality than anything that can be measured or observed externally. So when people speak of having a soul, they might be pointing toward this felt sense of being a continuous, present, witnessing, subjective self that somehow transcends the changing contents of experience. Whether this points to something metaphysically distinct from physical processes or simply represents how certain physical processes feel from the inside, remains one of the deepest questions we can ask. But the experience itself, this intimate sense of being you, remains undeniably real and remarkably mysterious, forming what many consider the experiential heart of whatever we might mean by soul. Modern neuroscience offers a fascinating lens through which to examine questions about the soul, though it arrives at this ancient mystery through entirely different methods than philosophy or spirituality. Rather than introspection or revelation, neuroscience uses brain imaging, electrical recordings, and careful experiments to map the neural correlates of consciousness and selfhood. What researchers have discovered is both illuminating and humbling, revealing extraordinary complexity in the brain's construction of selfhood, while simultaneously deepening the mystery of how subjective experience arises from objective neural processes. Brain imaging studies reveal that there's no single location where you reside, no neural equivalent of a cockpit where the essential you sits operating your body like a biological machine. Instead, your sense of being a unified self emerges from the coordinated activity of multiple brain networks, working together in intricate harmony. Different aspects of selfhood appear to be distributed across various brain regions, each contributing essential components to the overall experience of being you. This distributed processing suggests that the self, rather than being a thing, might be better understood as an ongoing process, a constantly updated construction project that your brain performs moment by moment. One of the most important discoveries involves what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a constellation of brain regions that becomes particularly active during rest and introspection. This network includes areas like the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, regions that seem to be involved in self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, and social cognition. When you daydream, reflect on your past, or imagine your future, the default mode network lights up with activity. Many researchers believe this network plays a crucial role in maintaining your sense of being a continuous self across time, weaving together memories, current experiences, and future projections into a coherent narrative of selfhood. But the default mode network doesn't work in isolation. Another crucial system, called the salience network, acts like a spotlight director, determining what deserves your attention from moment to moment. This network, anchored in regions like the anterior insula and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, helps decide whether to focus on external events or internal thoughts, whether something is important enough to interrupt your current mental activity, and how to switch between different modes of attention. The salience network essentially helps construct the boundary between self and world by deciding what counts as relevant to your current goals and concerns. A third major system, the executive network, centered in areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, manages higher-order cognitive functions like planning, decision-making, and working memory. This network could be thought of as the CEO of consciousness, organizing and directing mental resources to achieve goals, solve problems, and navigate complex situations. Together, these three networks create what many neuroscientists consider the core infrastructure of selfhood, though their interactions are far more complex and dynamic than this simplified description suggests. The picture becomes even more intricate when we consider how the brain integrates information across different sensory modalities and temporal scales. Your sense of having a unified body, for instance, emerges from the brain's integration of visual, proprioceptive, tactile, and vestibular information in regions like the temporoparietal junction. Damage to these areas can lead to fascinating disruptions of bodily self-awareness, such as out-of-body experiences or the feeling that parts of one's body don't belong to oneself. These conditions suggest that even our most basic sense of embodied selfhood depends on specific neural processes that can be disrupted, altered, or enhanced. Memory systems add another layer of complexity to the neural basis of selfhood. Your autobiographical memories aren't stored in a single location like files in a cabinet, but are reconstructed each time you remember them, involving coordination between the hippocampus, various cortical regions, and emotional centers like the amygdala. This reconstruction process means that your sense of having a continuous personal history is actually built anew each time you remember, potentially introducing subtle changes that gradually reshape your understanding of who you are and have been. Yet despite these detailed maps of neural activity, something crucial remains unexplained. We can identify which brain regions are active during self-related thinking, but we still can't explain why there should be any subjective experience accompanying this neural activity at all. This is what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. Neuroscience has made remarkable progress on what Chalmers calls the easy problems, understanding how the brain processes information, responds to stimuli, controls behavior, and integrates sensory data. But explaining why any of this processing should be accompanied by inner experience, by the felt sense of being you, remains as mysterious as ever. Consider the binding problem, one of neuroscience's most perplexing puzzles. Different features of your current experience, like the color of these words, their meaning, the sound of your breathing, the feeling of your body against whatever surface supports you, are processed by different brain regions at different speeds. Yet somehow, all of this distributed processing gets bound together into a single, unified, conscious experience. You don't experience separate streams of visual, auditory, and tactile consciousness that somehow coordinate their activities. Instead, you have one integrated experience of being you, here, now, aware of multiple things simultaneously. How the brain achieves this binding remains largely mysterious. Some neuroscientists propose that consciousness emerges from the brain's ability to integrate information across different regions and temporal scales. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory suggests that consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information in ways that are both differentiated, capable of many different states, and unified, combining information into a coherent whole. According to this theory, consciousness isn't something the brain has, but something it does, an ongoing process of information integration that creates the subjective experience of being a unified self in a unified world. But even if integrated information theory or similar approaches eventually explain how consciousness arises from neural activity, questions about the soul persist. If consciousness is indeed generated by information integration in the brain, what happens to the soul when the brain stops functioning? Does the pattern of information that constitutes your unique way of integrating experience have any existence independent of the neural substrate that generates it? These questions push us toward the deepest mysteries of mind, matter, and the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality. Consciousness remains perhaps the deepest mystery in all of science, a puzzle that has resisted centuries of investigation and continues to humble even our most sophisticated theories about how the universe works. We can map every neuron, trace every connection, predict behavior with increasing accuracy, and yet we still cannot explain the most basic fact about your existence: why there is something it feels like to be you. This explanatory gap between what we can observe objectively about brains and what we experience subjectively as conscious beings represents one of the fundamental limits of scientific understanding, a boundary that may tell us as much about the nature of reality itself as it does about the particular mystery of consciousness. The puzzle begins with what should be a simple question: why should information processing in the brain be accompanied by any inner experience at all? Consider your computer, which processes vast amounts of information, recognizes patterns, makes decisions, and responds to inputs in sophisticated ways. Yet we have no reason to believe your computer experiences anything when it performs these operations. It processes information about colors without seeing blue skies or red roses. It manipulates symbols representing sounds without hearing music or laughter. It calculates and stores and retrieves without any accompanying sense of what these operations feel like from the inside. The computer behaves as if it processes information, and indeed it does process information, but there appears to be no inner witness to this processing, no subjective experience accompanying the objective functions. So why should the information processing in your brain be any different? What is it about biological neural networks that gives rise to the felt experience of seeing blue, hearing music, or simply being aware that you exist? This question becomes even more puzzling when we consider that the basic operations of neurons are not fundamentally different from the operations of computer circuits. Neurons receive inputs, integrate information, and produce outputs, just like silicon chips. They do so using electrochemical processes rather than electronic ones, but the fundamental logic of information processing remains similar. Yet, somewhere in the complexity of neural interactions, something unprecedented happens. Subjective experience emerges. Philosopher David Chalmers articulated this puzzle by distinguishing between what he calls the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, though technically challenging, are conceptually straightforward. They include understanding how the brain processes sensory information, how it controls behavior, how it enables learning and memory, how it manages attention and decision-making. These problems are easy not because they are simple to solve, but because we can clearly see how to approach them using the standard methods of cognitive science and neuroscience. We may not have complete answers yet, but we understand what kinds of mechanisms could, in principle, explain these functions. The hard problem is different. It asks not how the brain processes information, but why this processing should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why should there be anything it feels like to have information processed in your brain? Why should you be a conscious subject experiencing qualia, those intrinsic, subjective qualities that make blue look blue to you rather than feeling like red or tasting like chocolate? The hard problem is hard because it is not clear what kind of explanation could possibly bridge the gap between objective, third-person descriptions of neural activity and subjective, first-person experience of what that activity feels like from the inside. This explanatory gap has led some philosophers and scientists to propose radical solutions. Eliminative materialists suggest that consciousness as we typically conceive it simply does not exist. In their view, there are no qualia, no inner experience, no felt sense of being you. There are only complex information processing systems that have evolved to create useful but ultimately illusory self-models. When you think you are experiencing the redness of red, you are actually just processing information in neural circuits that have been shaped by evolution to respond to certain wavelengths of light. The feeling of redness is not an additional property over and above the neural processing. It is simply how certain types of information processing appear when viewed from within the system doing the processing. Other thinkers have moved in the opposite direction, embracing various forms of panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality rather than something that emerges only in complex biological systems. In this view, even elementary particles possess some minimal form of experience or proto-consciousness. Complex conscious systems like human brains arise when these basic conscious elements combine in increasingly sophisticated ways, just as complex physical systems arise from the combination of elementary particles following physical laws. Panpsychism addresses the hard problem by denying that consciousness ever truly emerges from unconscious components, suggesting instead that it has been present at the most fundamental level of reality all along. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi and others, attempts to find a middle path between these extremes by proposing that consciousness corresponds to integrated information in any system, biological or otherwise. According to this theory, consciousness is not unique to brains but can arise in any system that integrates information in particular ways. The amount of consciousness corresponds to the quantity of integrated information, which the theory measures using a mathematical framework. This approach suggests that consciousness is not binary, either present or absent, but exists in degrees. Simple systems might possess minimal consciousness, while complex systems like human brains generate rich conscious experiences. But even these sophisticated approaches leave fundamental questions unanswered. If consciousness is information integration, why should information integration feel like anything? If consciousness is a basic feature of matter, how do elementary conscious elements combine to create unified experiences rather than collections of micro-experiences? And if consciousness is an illusion created by information processing, why does the illusion feel so convincing from the inside? Each proposed solution to the hard problem seems to push the mystery back one level without fully resolving it. The persistence of the hard problem has led some researchers to question whether it represents a genuine limitation of scientific understanding or simply reflects the current state of our knowledge. Perhaps future neuroscience will develop concepts and methods that make consciousness as explicable as other complex biological phenomena. Or perhaps consciousness represents a fundamental aspect of reality that cannot be reduced to physical processes, suggesting that our scientific worldview needs to be expanded to accommodate subjective experience as an irreducible feature of the universe. This uncertainty about the nature of consciousness directly bears on questions about the soul. If consciousness can be fully explained as the product of neural activity, then whatever we mean by soul might be nothing more than a particular pattern of information processing that ceases when the brain stops functioning. But if consciousness involves something beyond physical processes, if there is an irreducible subjective dimension to reality that cannot be captured by objective science, then the possibility remains open that this subjective aspect might transcend individual brains and bodies in ways that connect with traditional notions of soul. The hard problem of consciousness thus represents more than an academic puzzle. It points toward the limits of our current understanding and raises profound questions about the nature of mind, reality, and human existence. Whether consciousness is ultimately explicable in physical terms or requires us to expand our conception of reality remains one of the most important open questions in science and philosophy, one whose answer may determine whether concepts like soul belong to poetry or to the deepest truths about the universe. Some scientists and philosophers have proposed that consciousness emerges from the brain's remarkable ability to integrate information across different regions, time scales, and sensory modalities, in ways that create unified, coherent experiences from what would otherwise be a cacophony of separate neural processes. This approach, most fully developed in Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, offers one of the most mathematically sophisticated attempts to explain how subjective experience might arise from objective neural activity. According to this theory, consciousness does not reside in any particular brain region or neural process, but emerges from the specific ways information gets combined and unified across different parts of the nervous system. The central insight behind integrated information theory is that consciousness requires more than just information processing. After all, many non-conscious systems process information efficiently without generating any apparent inner experience. Your smartphone processes information about your location, the time, your contacts, and countless other data streams, but we have no reason to believe it experiences anything subjectively. Similarly, many brain processes occur without entering consciousness. Your visual system processes information about edges, colors, and motion in sophisticated ways that never become conscious experiences. The theory suggests that what distinguishes conscious information processing from non-conscious processing is integration, the extent to which information is combined across different parts of a system in ways that are both differentiated and unified. To understand what this means, consider how your brain constructs your current visual experience. Light hitting your retinas gets processed by different neural pathways that extract information about color, motion, depth, edges, and object recognition. These separate streams of processing occur in different brain regions at different speeds, yet somehow they all get bound together into a single, unified visual experience of the world around you. You don't experience separate streams of color consciousness, motion consciousness, and object consciousness that somehow coordinate their activities. Instead, you have one integrated visual experience that seamlessly combines all these different types of information into a coherent perception of a unified world. This binding process extends far beyond vision to encompass all aspects of conscious experience. Right now, your consciousness integrates visual information with sounds, bodily sensations, thoughts, emotions, memories, and expectations into a single, unified experience of being you in this moment. The theory suggests that this integration is not just a feature of consciousness, but is consciousness, or at least the objective basis from which subjective experience emerges. The more integrated the information processing in a system, the richer and more unified the conscious experience it generates. Integrated information theory attempts to make these ideas mathematically precise by defining consciousness in terms of a measure called phi, which quantifies the amount of integrated information in a system. Phi measures how much information is generated by a system above and beyond the information generated by its parts independently. A system with high phi integrates information in ways that create new, emergent properties that cannot be reduced to the simple sum of its components. A system with low phi processes information in more modular, segregated ways that generate less integrated conscious experience. This mathematical approach allows the theory to make specific predictions about which systems should be conscious and to what degree. According to the theory, consciousness is not binary but exists in degrees corresponding to the amount of integrated information a system generates. Simple systems like thermostats or photodiodes generate minimal phi and thus minimal consciousness, if any. Complex biological systems like human brains generate high phi and thus rich conscious experiences. The theory also suggests that consciousness could, in principle, arise in artificial systems if they integrate information in the appropriate ways, regardless of whether they are made of biological neurons or silicon circuits. One counterintuitive implication of the theory is that consciousness might be more widespread in the universe than we typically assume. Any system that integrates information could possess some degree of consciousness, including some systems we don't usually think of as conscious. The theory suggests that even simple networks of interacting elements could generate minimal conscious experiences if they integrate information in the right ways. This doesn't mean that every physical system is conscious, but it does suggest that consciousness might arise in systems simpler and more varied than biological brains. The theory also addresses some puzzling features of consciousness that other approaches struggle to explain. For instance, why does consciousness seem to have a limited capacity? Why can't you consciously attend to dozens of things simultaneously with perfect clarity? Integrated information theory suggests that consciousness represents the maximum amount of information that can be integrated by your nervous system at any given moment. The limited capacity of consciousness reflects the computational constraints of information integration rather than arbitrary design limitations. The theory also offers explanations for altered states of consciousness. Psychedelic substances, for instance, appear to disrupt the normal patterns of information integration in the brain, leading to experiences where the usual boundaries between different aspects of experience become fluid or dissolved. Similarly, meditative states might involve changes in how information gets integrated across different brain networks, potentially leading to experiences where the sense of being a separate self temporarily recedes as information integration patterns shift. However, integrated information theory faces significant challenges and criticisms. One major problem is the theory's implication that many systems we don't typically consider conscious, including some simple networks and even certain arrangements of photodiodes, could possess consciousness according to the theory's mathematical definitions. Critics argue that this leads to an implausible proliferation of conscious systems throughout the universe. Another challenge is that the theory has been difficult to test experimentally, partly because calculating phi requires complete knowledge of a system's connectivity and dynamics, which is currently impossible for systems as complex as human brains. Perhaps most fundamentally, the theory still faces a version of the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we accept that consciousness corresponds to integrated information, the theory doesn't fully explain why integrated information should feel like anything from the inside. Why should there be subjective experience accompanying information integration rather than just more sophisticated information processing without inner experience? The theory provides a precise mathematical description of what consciousness does, but it doesn't fully bridge the explanatory gap between objective information processing and subjective experience. Nevertheless, integrated information theory represents one of the most serious attempts to develop a scientific theory of consciousness that could potentially inform our understanding of the soul. If consciousness does indeed emerge from information integration, this raises intriguing questions about the relationship between individual conscious systems and larger patterns of information flow in the universe. Could the soul represent a particular pattern of integrated information that might, under certain circumstances, transcend individual brains? Or does the theory's focus on specific physical systems mean that consciousness necessarily ends when those systems stop functioning? These questions push us toward the deepest mysteries of mind, information, and reality itself. Your soul, if it exists, doesn't float somewhere above your head like a cartoon ghost, or reside in some ethereal realm disconnected from your physical being. Instead, whatever we might call soul appears to be intimately woven into the fabric of your embodied existence, inseparably connected to your breathing, your heartbeat, your posture, and the countless subtle ways your mind and body communicate in an ongoing conversation that never pauses, even in sleep. This embodied understanding of consciousness challenges purely mental concepts of the soul, suggesting that whatever constitutes your deepest self includes both mind and flesh in a partnership so complete that attempting to separate them may be like trying to divide wetness from water. Consider how profoundly your emotional states are reflected in and influenced by your physical posture. When you feel confident, your shoulders naturally lift and your spine straightens. When anxiety arises, your chest might tighten and your breathing becomes shallow. Depression often manifests as a literal heaviness, a sinking feeling that affects not just mood but actual muscular tension and energy levels throughout your body. These aren't just metaphorical descriptions. They reflect genuine psychophysical connections where mental states and bodily conditions influence each other in complex feedback loops that make it difficult to say where mind ends and body begins. The vagus nerve exemplifies this mind-body integration in particularly striking ways. This longest cranial nerve wanders from your brainstem down through your chest and abdomen, connecting brain and body in constant two-way communication. Your vagus nerve influences heart rate, breathing, digestion, and immune function, while simultaneously carrying information about bodily states back to the brain. When you take slow, deep breaths during meditation or moments of stress, you're not just calming your mind. You're actively communicating with your vagus nerve in ways that influence both psychological and physiological states. The nerve responds by shifting your nervous system toward what researchers call the rest and digest response, creating cascading effects that touch everything from inflammation levels to social bonding hormones. This embodied view of consciousness finds support in contemporary neuroscience research, showing that emotion and cognition are far more interconnected than previously believed. The insula, a brain region tucked deep within the cerebral cortex, processes both emotional states and interoceptive awareness, your sense of internal bodily signals like hunger, thirst, and the feeling of your heartbeat. People with greater interoceptive sensitivity often show enhanced emotional awareness and better ability to regulate their emotional responses. This suggests that the soul's emotional intelligence, if we can call it that, may depend partly on how well you can tune into and interpret your body's subtle signals. Even phantom limb sensations point toward the embodied nature of consciousness in ways that complicate simple mind-body dualism. People who have lost limbs often continue to feel sensations in the missing body parts, sometimes for years after amputation. These phantom sensations suggest that consciousness extends into what neuroscientists call the body schema, your brain's map of your physical form and its boundaries. This body schema can be remarkably flexible. Experiments show that people can quickly incorporate tools or even rubber hands into their sense of embodied self when visual and tactile feedback align properly. Such findings suggest that whatever constitutes the soul includes this dynamic, adaptable sense of embodied presence in the world. Meditation traditions have long recognized this fundamental unity of mind and body, teaching practices that work simultaneously with mental attention and physical presence. Mindfulness meditation typically involves paying careful attention to breathing, posture, and bodily sensations, not as separate from spiritual development but as integral to it. The Buddha's teachings include extensive instructions on body contemplation, recognizing that insight into the nature of mind requires intimate familiarity with embodied experience. Yoga literally means union, referring to the integration of mental and physical practices in service of spiritual awakening. Tai Chi and Qigong cultivate what practitioners describe as the flow of Qi, or life energy, through specific movements that align body, breath, and attention. These contemplative traditions suggest that spiritual insight emerges not from transcending the body, but from fully inhabiting it with awareness and acceptance. When you sit in meditation and notice tension in your shoulders, the practice isn't to ignore this physical sensation in favor of more spiritual concerns, but to bring kind attention to the tension itself, investigating how it relates to mental patterns of holding and resistance. The body becomes a teacher, offering moment-by-moment feedback about the quality of your attention and the subtle ways you contract or expand in response to experience. This embodied understanding extends to how we relate to others and to the world around us. Mirror neurons fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action, creating neural resonance between your embodied experience and that of others. When you see someone smile genuinely, mirror neurons contribute to your tendency to smile in response, creating emotional contagion that happens below the threshold of conscious awareness. Similarly, when you witness someone in pain, your brain activates some of the same regions involved in your own pain experience. These neurological discoveries suggest that empathy and compassion, often considered spiritual capacities, emerge from embodied processes that blur the boundaries between self and other. The gut microbiome adds another layer to embodied consciousness that scientists are only beginning to understand. The bacteria living in your digestive system influence neurotransmitter production, immune function, and even behavior in ways that affect mood, anxiety, and social functioning. This gut-brain axis means that what you eat, the health of your digestive system, and the microbial ecosystem you carry within you all influence mental states in direct, measurable ways. Some researchers playfully refer to the gut microbiome as your second brain, but it might be more accurate to say that brain and gut form one integrated system for processing both nutrients and information about the world. Cultural practices around the world reflect this intuitive understanding of embodied spirituality. Indigenous traditions often include dance, drumming, and other physical practices as integral to spiritual ceremony. Many religious traditions incorporate specific postures, gestures, and movements into prayer and worship. Even secular practices like running, swimming, or hiking can evoke what people describe as spiritual experiences, suggesting that certain forms of embodied engagement with the world naturally give rise to expanded states of consciousness. This embodied perspective on the soul doesn't necessarily resolve questions about survival after death or the ultimate nature of consciousness, but it does ground these inquiries in the lived reality of being a conscious, feeling, breathing, being in a physical world. Whatever the soul might be, it expresses itself through and as your embodied presence, your capacity to feel and move and breathe and relate to others through the medium of physical existence. The soul, in this view, is not imprisoned in the body, but fulfilled through it, not separate from physical reality, but intimately woven into its deepest patterns and possibilities. Perhaps the soul isn't something you possess as an individual, but rather something that emerges between us, in the spaces where lives intersect and meaning gets created through relationship, language, culture, and the ongoing human project of making sense of existence together. This relational understanding challenges the common assumption that the soul is primarily a private, internal phenomenon, suggesting instead that whatever constitutes your deepest self develops through and depends upon your connections with others, the stories you share, the values you inherit and transform, and the ways you participate in the larger webs of meaning that bind communities together across time. Your sense of who you are began forming in relationship long before you had words to describe it. As an infant, you developed your earliest understanding of self through countless interactions with caregivers, learning to distinguish between self and other through the rhythms of feeding, comforting, and play. The quality of these early relationships literally shaped your developing nervous system, influencing everything from stress responses to social bonding patterns to your basic sense of whether the world is trustworthy and whether you are worthy of love and care. In this sense, your soul was never purely your own creation, but emerged from the relational matrix in which you were embedded from your first moments of life. Language offers another profound example of how the soul might be fundamentally social rather than individual. The thoughts you think, the emotions you can recognize and name, the ways you understand yourself and your place in the world all depend on linguistic and cultural frameworks you inherited from others. You didn't invent the words you use to describe your inner experience. You learned them through countless interactions with parents, teachers, friends, and the broader cultural conversation mediated through books, films, songs, and stories. Even your most private thoughts unfold in languages you share with millions of others, suggesting that the boundary between inner and outer, self and culture, may be far more porous than it initially appears. Psychologist Dan McAdams proposes that identity emerges through what he calls the integrative life narrative, the ongoing story you tell yourself about who you are, where you came from, and where you're going. This narrative doesn't arise in isolation, but develops through interaction with others who help you make sense of your experiences, validate certain aspects of your story, and challenge others. The characters in your life narrative include not just people you know personally, but also historical figures, fictional characters, and cultural archetypes that provide templates for understanding different ways of being human. Your soul, in this view, is less a fixed essence you discover, and more a story you're continuously co-creating with the human community across time. The values that guide your decisions and shape your character also emerge from relational processes that extend far beyond individual choice. You didn't develop your moral intuitions in isolation, but absorbed them through family dynamics, cultural traditions, educational experiences, and countless social interactions that taught you what kinds of behaviors are praised, punished, celebrated, or condemned in your community. Even when you rebel against certain inherited values, your rebellion takes shape in relationship to what you're rejecting, suggesting that even your most individual moral stances develop through engagement with collective wisdom and collective blind spots. Religious and spiritual traditions have long recognized this social dimension of soul development. Most traditions emphasize community practice, collective worship, shared rituals, and intergenerational transmission of wisdom as essential aspects of spiritual development. The Jewish concept of minyan requires 10 adults for certain prayers, recognizing that some spiritual experiences emerge only in community. Christian traditions speak of the body of Christ, understanding individual souls as parts of a larger spiritual organism. Buddhist Sangha represents one of the three jewels, alongside Buddha and Dharma, acknowledging that the spiritual path unfolds most fully in relationship with others, traveling the same direction. Indigenous wisdom traditions often take this relational understanding even further, seeing individual souls as inseparable from the web of relationships that includes not just human community but also ancestors, future generations, animals, plants, and the living earth itself. In many Native American traditions, decisions are made with consideration for their impact 7 generations into the future, recognizing that individual actions ripple through time and space in ways that connect each person to a much larger community of life. From this perspective, the health of individual souls depends on the health of the entire web of relationships in which they are embedded. Contemporary research in social psychology supports these traditional insights about the relational nature of identity and well-being. Studies consistently show that people with strong social connections live longer, healthier, and more satisfying lives than those who are socially isolated. Loneliness has health impacts comparable to smoking or obesity, suggesting that relationship isn't just nice to have, but essential for human flourishing at the most basic biological level. Mirror neurons, empathy, emotional contagion, and social bonding hormones like oxytocin all point toward ways that individual nervous systems are designed to connect with and influence each other in ongoing feedback loops that blur the boundaries between separate selves. The stories cultures tell about heroes, saints, and exemplary individuals also shape how souls develop by providing models of human possibility that individuals can aspire to embody. When you read about someone who faced adversity with grace, made sacrifices for others, or discovered something beautiful or true, their story becomes part of your inner landscape, influencing how you understand what kinds of people it's possible to become. In this sense, the souls of individuals who have never met can influence each other across vast distances of space and time through the medium of story and example. Even your most private spiritual experiences often unfold in relationship to others, even when you're physically alone. Prayer typically involves relationship with divine presence. Meditation often includes relationship with teachers, traditions, and communities of practice that provide guidance and support. Contemplation of nature involves relationship with the living world and the countless beings whose existence makes your own life possible. Even solitary reflection draws on language, concepts, and frameworks that emerged from collective human exploration of consciousness and meaning across thousands of years. This social understanding of the soul doesn't eliminate individual responsibility or reduce personal experience to mere social conditioning. Rather, it suggests that individuality itself emerges through relationship, that the unique contribution each person makes to the human conversation depends on their particular way of integrating and responding to the influences they encounter. Your soul might be understood as your unique way of participating in the larger conversation of human meaning-making, the distinctive voice you add to the choir of consciousness that extends from the earliest humans who wondered about their place in the cosmos to future generations who will inherit and transform the wisdom we're creating together. Right now, this relational perspective also suggests that caring for your own soul and caring for the souls of others might be ultimately inseparable projects. If the health of individual souls depends on the health of the communities and relationships in which they develop, then spiritual practice naturally includes attention to social justice, environmental stewardship, and the cultivation of conditions that allow all souls to flourish. The boundaries between personal and political, individual and collective, spiritual and social begin to dissolve when we recognize that we exist not as separate souls temporarily interacting, but as expressions of one larger soul, temporarily experiencing itself as many. Throughout history, people across cultures have reported experiences that seem to transcend the boundaries of ordinary consciousness. Moments when the usual sense of being a separate self appears to dissolve or expand beyond individual identity into something vast and interconnected. These experiences include near-death encounters, where people report leaving their bodies and encountering realms of light and love, mystical states, where the boundary between self and universe seems to disappear, profound spiritual visions that feel more real than everyday reality, and encounters with presences that seem to offer guidance or comfort from beyond the physical world. While these experiences vary dramatically in their specific content and cultural interpretation, they share certain common features that have led many to view them as evidence for dimensions of reality that extend beyond what can be measured by conventional scientific instruments. Near-death experiences represent perhaps the most extensively studied category of these extraordinary states of consciousness. Thousands of people who have been clinically dead or very close to death report remarkably consistent elements in their experiences, moving through tunnels of light, encountering deceased relatives or spiritual beings, experiencing life reviews, where their entire existence flashes before them with unprecedented clarity, visiting realms that feel more vivid and real than ordinary reality, and receiving messages about the purpose of life and the nature of love. These reports come from people of all ages, cultural backgrounds, and religious beliefs, including many who were previously skeptical about spiritual matters or life after death. Research by cardiologist Pim van Lommel and others has documented these experiences in clinical settings, interviewing patients who were resuscitated after cardiac arrest. Van Lommel's studies found that about 18% of cardiac arrest patients reported near-death experiences, and these experiences occurred even when brain activity was undetectable by standard monitoring equipment. The patients who had these experiences often showed profound and lasting changes in their values, relationships, and spiritual beliefs, becoming less materialistic and more focused on love, service, and personal growth. Many reported losing their fear of death entirely, viewing it as a transition rather than an ending. Neuroscientist Eben Alexander's account of his own near-death experience during a coma caused by bacterial meningitis added another dimension to these discussions. As someone trained in conventional neuroscience, Alexander initially tried to explain his experience in terms of brain chemistry and hallucination. However, the fact that his experience occurred while his cortex was effectively offline, as confirmed by medical monitoring, led him to conclude that consciousness might not be produced by the brain, but rather transmitted or focused by it, like a radio receiving signals from a broader field of awareness. Mystical experiences, while often occurring without life-threatening medical crises, share many features with near-death accounts. People report profound states of unity consciousness, where the sense of being a separate self dissolves into awareness of fundamental interconnectedness with all existence. These experiences often involve overwhelming feelings of unconditional love, deep peace, and understanding that transcends ordinary conceptual knowledge. The mystic might feel directly connected to what they interpret as divine presence, cosmic consciousness, or the true nature of reality itself. Such experiences have been reported by contemplatives across religious traditions, from Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart to Sufi poets like Rumi to Hindu sages and Buddhist masters throughout history. Contemporary research has begun mapping the neural correlates of mystical experiences, particularly those induced by meditation, psychedelic substances, or other consciousness-altering practices. Studies using brain imaging during mystical states show decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of being a separate self. This finding aligns with subjective reports of ego dissolution and unity consciousness. However, the fact that these experiences have measurable neural correlates doesn't necessarily explain them away as mere brain states. The relationship between neural activity and subjective experience remains as mysterious as ever, and the correlation between brain changes and mystical experiences could support various interpretations. Some researchers propose that these experiences represent the brain's response to extreme stress, oxygen deprivation, or chemical changes, creating hallucinations that feel profound because they activate reward centers and memory consolidation systems. From this perspective, near-death and mystical experiences are elaborate constructions of a brain under duress, drawing on cultural and religious imagery to create meaningful narratives out of chaotic neural firing. The consistency of these experiences across cultures might reflect universal features of brain architecture and the human tendency to interpret unusual states through available spiritual frameworks. Others argue that reducing these experiences to brain chemistry misses their most significant aspects. Many people who have mystical or near-death experiences report receiving information they couldn't have known through normal sensory channels, encountering deceased individuals they had never met, but later verified existed, or gaining insights that prove useful in ways that seem to transcend hallucination. The profound and lasting transformations these experiences often catalyze in people's lives suggests something more substantial than mere neurological misfiring. The debate over these extraordinary experiences touches on fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. If consciousness is entirely produced by brain activity, then experiences occurring when brain function is severely compromised or apparently absent become difficult to explain. But if consciousness involves something beyond neural activity, if it participates in dimensions of reality not captured by current scientific instruments, then these experiences might represent genuine encounters with aspects of existence normally filtered out by ordinary waking consciousness. Indigenous wisdom traditions have long recognized altered states of consciousness as legitimate ways of gaining knowledge about reality. Vision quests, sweat lodges, plant medicine ceremonies, and other traditional practices deliberately induce non-ordinary states of consciousness that are viewed as sources of healing, guidance, and spiritual insight. From these perspectives, the Western scientific worldview's exclusion of subjective experience and non-ordinary states of consciousness represents a profound limitation that cuts us off from important dimensions of reality and sources of wisdom. Whether these experiences reveal actual metaphysical realities beyond the physical world or represent fascinating quirks of consciousness under extraordinary conditions remains hotly debated. Perhaps more important than resolving this debate definitively is recognizing what these experiences suggest about the remarkable plasticity and depth of human consciousness. They point to capacities for experience that stretch our understanding of what it means to be conscious, what it means to be connected to others and to the world, and what it means to find meaning and purpose in existence. They remind us that the territory of consciousness extends far beyond the maps provided by ordinary waking awareness, and that the mystery of what we are may be far more profound and beautiful than our everyday assumptions suggest. If the soul exists as something more than a useful metaphor or an emergent property of complex neural networks, one of the most profound questions we can ask is whether it survives the dissolution of the physical body. This question has driven religious thought, philosophical inquiry, and increasingly scientific investigation for millennia, representing perhaps the ultimate test of whether consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of individual biological existence. The stakes of this inquiry feel deeply personal because the possibility of survival touches our most fundamental hopes and fears about the nature of existence, the meaning of relationships, and whether the love, growth, and understanding we cultivate during life has significance that transcends the apparent finality of death. Different religious and philosophical traditions have approached this question with varying degrees of confidence and vastly different conceptual frameworks. Some traditions, like certain forms of Christianity and Islam, propose that individual souls survive death intact, maintaining personal identity and memories while transitioning to different realms of existence where moral accounts are settled and eternal relationships with the divine are established. These traditions often emphasize resurrection or reconstitution of embodied existence, suggesting that souls are ultimately meant to be reunited with physical forms, albeit transformed and perfected versions that transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. Other traditions, particularly those influenced by Hindu and Buddhist thought, propose that while some aspect of consciousness or karmic continuity persists beyond individual death, personal identity, as we normally understand it, dissolves in the process. In these frameworks, what survives might be better understood as a stream of consciousness or a pattern of karmic energy that takes new forms through reincarnation, but without necessarily maintaining the specific memories, personality traits, or relationships that defined the previous incarnation. The goal of spiritual development in many of these traditions involves eventually transcending the cycle of death and rebirth entirely, merging individual consciousness back into universal consciousness, or achieving states of liberation that transcend the dualities of life and death, self and other. Contemporary research into anomalous phenomena has provided intriguing but inconclusive evidence that some aspect of consciousness might persist beyond biological death. Studies of apparent communication with deceased individuals, conducted by researchers like Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona, have documented cases where mediums provide specific information about deceased persons that the researchers claim could not have been obtained through conventional means. These studies attempt to apply scientific controls to phenomena traditionally relegated to the realm of faith or superstition, though the results remain controversial and disputed within the broader scientific community. Research into reincarnation memories, most extensively conducted by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson and continued by his colleague Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, has documented thousands of cases where young children report detailed memories of previous lives that can be verified through historical research. These cases often involve children who provide specific names, locations, and details about deceased individuals they claim to have been, information that the children's families insist they could not have learned through normal channels. While critics propose various explanations involving fraud, coincidence, or cryptomnesia, the sheer volume and specificity of some cases has led even skeptical researchers to acknowledge that the phenomenon deserves serious investigation. Quantum theories of consciousness have introduced new conceptual possibilities for thinking about survival. Some physicists and consciousness researchers propose that consciousness involves quantum processes that might not be entirely dependent on classical neural activity. If consciousness participates in quantum fields or information processing systems that extend beyond individual brains, it becomes theoretically possible that some aspects of individual consciousness could persist in these fields even after the brain stops functioning. However, these theories remain highly speculative and lack empirical verification. The question of survival becomes particularly complex when we consider what exactly would survive. If consciousness is as dependent on specific neural networks as current neuroscience suggests, what aspect of personal identity could possibly transcend the death of those networks? Would survival involve maintaining all of your memories, personality traits, and relationships, or would it represent something more fundamental but less personally continuous? If your consciousness emerged from the specific history of your embodied existence in the world, including your relationships, experiences, and cultural context, could it maintain coherence in a radically different state of existence? Some philosophers and researchers have proposed that the question itself might be based on false assumptions about the nature of personal identity and consciousness. If the self is more process than thing, more pattern than substance, then survival might not involve the continuation of a discrete individual entity, but rather the persistence of certain patterns, relationships, or information structures in different forms. Your influence on others, the ideas you've shared, the love you've given and received, the knowledge you've contributed to human understanding all continue to exist and influence the world long after your biological death, creating a kind of distributed immortality through ongoing effects and relationships. Near-death experiences, as discussed in the previous section, provide some of the most compelling subjective evidence for survival, yet they remain open to multiple interpretations. Even if we accept that these experiences involve genuine encounters with non-physical realms or beings, questions remain about whether they represent actual preview of post-mortem existence or something more complex about the nature of consciousness under extreme conditions. The fact that near-death experiences often reflect cultural and religious expectations suggests that if survival exists, it might be far more mysterious and different from our current concepts than these experiences indicate. The implications of survival versus non-survival extend far beyond individual concerns about personal continuity. If consciousness ends with brain death, this might support views that emphasize the preciousness and urgency of present existence, the importance of creating meaning and connection within the span of biological life, and the need to address suffering and injustice in this world rather than hoping for compensation in an afterlife. Alternatively, if some aspect of consciousness survives death, this might provide foundations for meaning and morality that transcend individual lifespans, offering comfort in the face of loss and motivation for ethical behavior based on consequences that extend beyond earthly existence. Perhaps the most honest approach to the question of survival acknowledges the fundamental uncertainty that currently surrounds it. Neither scientific materialism nor religious faith provides conclusive proof of their claims about what happens to consciousness after death. The evidence remains ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations, and deeply intertwined with our most basic assumptions about the nature of mind, reality, and personal identity. This uncertainty need not be cause for despair, but could instead invite a kind of humble wonder about the mystery of existence itself. What may be more important than resolving the question of survival definitively is how contemplating it shapes our relationship to life itself. Whether consciousness survives death or dissolves with the brain, the fact that we can ask the question, that we care about the answer, and that we form relationships profound enough to make the possibility of loss meaningful, points to something remarkable about the nature of conscious existence. In grappling with mortality, we discover what we value most deeply, what connections feel most sacred, and what aspects of existence seem to transcend the boundaries of individual life, even within the span of our embodied existence. Some of the deepest questions about the soul emerge not during moments of transcendent bliss or peaceful contemplation, but in times of profound suffering, loss, and hardship. When the familiar structures of identity and meaning get stripped away, and we're left facing what feels like the raw core of existence. It's in these crucible moments, when everything we thought we were seems to dissolve under pressure, that many people report discovering something within themselves that feels more essential and enduring than the surface layers of personality, achievement, and social identity that normally define their sense of self. This suggests that whatever we mean by soul might not be something we possess comfortably, but rather something that reveals itself most clearly when comfort is no longer available. Trauma has a way of shattering our ordinary assumptions about safety, control, and the predictable nature of existence. When someone experiences profound loss, betrayal, illness, or violence, the psychological structures they use to navigate the world often prove inadequate to contain or make sense of their new reality. The stories they told themselves about who they were and how the world works can collapse entirely, leaving them in a state of existential freefall where nothing feels certain or solid. Yet within this dissolution, many trauma survivors report discovering capacities for resilience, compassion, and wisdom that they didn't know they possessed, as if some deeper layer of their being had been activated by the extremity of their circumstances. Post-traumatic growth, a concept developed by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, describes how some people emerge from traumatic experiences with enhanced appreciation for life, deeper relationships, greater personal strength, expanded spiritual development, and clearer priorities about what truly matters. This isn't simply a matter of returning to previous levels of functioning or finding silver linings in terrible experiences. Rather, it represents genuine transformation, where individuals discover new dimensions of their own capacity for meaning-making, connection, and purpose that seem to emerge from wrestling directly with life's most challenging realities. Viktor Frankl's experiences in Nazi concentration camps led him to develop logotherapy, a therapeutic approach based on the insight that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. Frankl observed that some prisoners, faced with the most extreme dehumanization and brutality, maintained an inner freedom that could not be destroyed by external circumstances. They found ways to preserve dignity, compassion, and hope, even when everything else had been taken from them. Frankl described this capacity for meaning-making as representing something indestructible in human nature, something that transcends the circumstances of any particular life situation. This doesn't mean that suffering is inherently valuable or that trauma is a prerequisite for spiritual development. Many people find meaning, connection, and transcendence through joy, creativity, love, and service without experiencing profound adversity. The point is rather that when suffering does occur, it sometimes catalyzes encounters with dimensions of human capacity that remain hidden during more comfortable periods of life. It's as if extreme circumstances can burn away superficial layers of identity to reveal more fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. Spiritual traditions across cultures have long recognized this transformative potential of suffering. The Buddha's first noble truth acknowledges that suffering is inherent to existence, but his subsequent teachings suggest that this suffering can become a path to liberation if met with wisdom and compassion. Christian mysticism speaks of the dark night of the soul, periods of spiritual dryness and apparent abandonment that can paradoxically lead to deeper union with divine presence. Indigenous traditions often include vision quests and other ritual ordeals designed to facilitate encounters with deeper sources of guidance and strength. The soul's relationship to suffering also appears in how people navigate grief and loss. When someone loses a beloved person, the initial stages of grief often involve disorientation and a sense that part of themselves has died along with their loved one. Yet many bereaved individuals report that over time their relationship with the deceased person doesn't simply end, but transforms into something that continues to provide meaning, guidance, and connection. They may feel the presence of their loved one in dreams, synchronicities, or moments of particular beauty or difficulty. Whether interpreted as actual communication with departed souls or as psychological processes of internalization and meaning-making, these experiences suggest that love creates bonds that transcend the boundaries of individual physical existence. Serious illness often precipitates similar encounters with questions about the soul's essential nature. When the body becomes unreliable or the mind is affected by disease, people sometimes discover that their sense of who they are extends beyond these compromised systems. They may find that illness strips away attachments to roles, achievements, and external markers of success, revealing priorities and relationships that feel more fundamental to their actual identity. Many report that facing mortality clarifies what has been truly important in their lives and what has been mere distraction or ego gratification. Addiction recovery also provides insights into the soul's relationship to suffering and transformation. Many recovery programs explicitly include spiritual components, recognizing that overcoming addiction often requires connecting with sources of strength and meaning that transcend individual willpower. The 12-step tradition speaks of hitting bottom as sometimes necessary for genuine transformation to begin, not because suffering is good in itself, but because it can create the desperation and humility necessary to seek help from sources beyond the isolated ego. Recovery often involves discovering that the soul's deepest needs cannot be satisfied by substances or behaviors that provide temporary escape from pain or emptiness. These encounters with suffering don't automatically produce wisdom or spiritual development. Trauma can also lead to lasting psychological damage, chronic mistrust, or spiritual despair. Loss can result in bitterness or withdrawal rather than expanded compassion. Illness can generate fear and resentment rather than clarity about priorities. The difference seems to lie partly in how individuals and communities respond to suffering, whether they can find supportive relationships and meaning-making frameworks that help transform pain into growth rather than allowing it to become destructive or consuming. What emerges from this exploration is a picture of the soul not as something we have, but as something we become through facing life's deepest challenges with courage, openness, and connection to others. If the soul exists, it might be less a possession to be protected and more a capacity to be developed, less a fixed essence, and more a dynamic relationship to existence that can deepen through engagement with both joy and sorrow. The suffering that initially seems to threaten the soul's integrity may actually provide opportunities for its most profound development, revealing dimensions of human resilience and wisdom that remain dormant until necessity calls them forth. Meditation traditions offer perhaps the most direct and systematic approach to exploring the nature of what we might call the soul, providing methods for turning attention inward to observe the very awareness that observes all experience. Through sustained practice of watching thoughts arise and pass away, emotions surge and recede, and sensations appear and disappear throughout the body, meditators report discovering layers of identity that seem to exist at different depths of experience. At the surface level, there's the constant stream of mental commentary, planning, remembering, and analyzing that usually dominates waking consciousness. Beneath this, practitioners often encounter emotional patterns and bodily tensions that carry the residue of past experiences. But at even deeper levels, many report discovering something that feels like pure awareness itself, a witnessing consciousness that remains constant while everything else changes. This witnessing awareness seems to have qualities that distinguish it from the contents it observes. While thoughts come and go, the awareness that notices thoughts appears remarkably stable. While emotions arise with great intensity and then fade, the consciousness that experiences emotions remains unperturbed by their comings and goings. While physical sensations shift constantly throughout the body, the awareness that feels these sensations seems somehow spacious and unchanging. This leads many contemplatives to identify this witnessing consciousness with what they mean by soul, the deepest and most essential aspect of what they are. Different meditation traditions describe this discovery using various metaphors and conceptual frameworks, but remarkable similarities emerge across cultures and centuries. Buddhist practitioners speak of discovering the nature of mind itself, a basic awareness that exists prior to any particular mental content. Hindu contemplatives describe realizing their true nature as consciousness itself, the Atman that is ultimately identical with universal consciousness, or Brahman. Christian mystics write about encountering what they call the ground of being, or the spark of divinity within the soul that remains unaffected by the ups and downs of ordinary experience. The practice of meditation typically begins with concentration exercises designed to stabilize attention and reduce the mental agitation that normally prevents subtle observations of consciousness itself. Students might focus on breathing, repeat mantras, or contemplate visual objects. gradually developing the capacity to sustain attention without being constantly pulled away by thoughts, emotions, or sensory distractions. As concentration deepens, practitioners often report that the usual sense of effortful doing gives way to more spacious states where awareness seems to sustain itself naturally without requiring constant vigilance or control. As meditation practice matures, many practitioners shift toward what are sometimes called mindfulness or insight practices, where instead of concentrating on a single object, they learn to observe whatever arises in consciousness with equanimity and curiosity. They watch thoughts appear and dissolve without getting caught up in their content. They notice emotions arising in the body and mind without immediately reacting or trying to change them. They observe physical sensations with detailed attention while recognizing their impermanent nature. Through this patient observation, they begin to see patterns in their own mental and emotional habits, while simultaneously discovering the awareness that remains present through all these changing phenomena. One of the most significant discoveries many meditators report is the gradual recognition that the observer and the observed are not actually separate phenomena. Initially, there seems to be a clear distinction between the witness consciousness and the contents of consciousness it observes. But with deeper practice, this duality often dissolves into recognition of a unified field of awareness within which all experience arises. There's no separate self-observing thoughts. There's just thinking happening within awareness. There's no detached witness watching emotions. There's just feeling arising and passing within the space of consciousness itself. This dissolution of the observer-observed duality can be initially disorienting for practitioners accustomed to thinking of themselves as separate beings having experiences. But many report that this recognition brings profound peace and liberation from the constant effort of trying to manage or control experience. Instead of being someone who has to deal with thoughts and emotions, they recognize themselves as the spacious awareness within which all experience unfolds naturally. This shift often reduces psychological suffering significantly because there's no longer a sense of being victimized by mental and emotional states. Instead, these states are recognized as temporary movements within one's own deeper nature. Advanced practitioners across traditions often describe states where even the sense of being an individual practitioner dissolves entirely. In these states, there's no meditator and no meditation, just pure being or consciousness knowing itself without any sense of separation or boundaries. These experiences are often described as encounters with what mystics call the absolute, ultimate reality, or God, though the interpretations vary widely across different theological and philosophical frameworks. Some understand these states as temporary glimpses of enlightenment or unity consciousness, while others view them as insights into the nature of reality that exists beneath all apparent multiplicity and separation. The question of whether these meditative discoveries reveal something metaphysically real about the soul or simply demonstrate how consciousness appears when observed under particular conditions remains actively debated. Neuroscientists studying meditation have documented significant changes in brain activity during contemplative states, including alterations in regions associated with self-referential thinking, emotional regulation, and attention. These findings could support either interpretation. The neural changes might explain meditative experiences as interesting but ultimately subjective states produced by specific patterns of brain activity, or they might represent the physical correlates of consciousness encountering deeper dimensions of its own nature. Many contemplatives argue that the proof of meditation's insights lies not in external validation, but in their transformative effects on daily life. Practitioners often report increased emotional stability, greater compassion for themselves and others, reduced reactivity to stressful situations, and enhanced capacity to find meaning and peace regardless of external circumstances. They describe feeling more authentically themselves, while simultaneously being less attached to particular ideas about who they are. This paradox suggests that discovering the soul through meditation might involve both finding one's deepest nature and letting go of fixed concepts about what that nature might be. The contemplative exploration of consciousness also raises important questions about the relationship between individual and universal aspects of awareness. If the deepest discoveries of meditation involve recognizing consciousness as a unified field rather than a collection of separate individual minds, this has profound implications for understanding the soul's boundaries and relationships. Some traditions suggest that individual souls are like waves on the ocean of universal consciousness, temporarily distinct but ultimately inseparable from the whole. Others maintain that individual identity persists even within unity consciousness, like instruments in a cosmic orchestra that remain distinct while contributing to a larger harmony. Whether these contemplative insights represent literal discoveries about the metaphysical nature of souls or profound psychological shifts in how consciousness relates to its own contents, millions of practitioners across centuries have found in meditation a direct path to exploring whatever we mean by our deepest nature. In the stillness of sustained attention to awareness itself, questions about the soul move from intellectual speculation toward direct investigation, offering each practitioner the opportunity to explore firsthand the mystery of what it means to be conscious, present, and awake. Artists, writers, musicians, and other creative individuals often speak of inspiration as something that moves through them rather than originating from their conscious planning or deliberate effort. They describe moments when ideas seem to arrive from somewhere beyond their ordinary thinking mind, when solutions to creative problems appear suddenly in dreams or during walks, when entire poems, melodies, or visual compositions seem to download into consciousness as complete wholes, rather than being constructed piece by piece through analytical thought. This experience of creativity as reception rather than generation has led many to wonder whether the creative process reveals something about the soul's connection to sources of knowledge, beauty, and meaning that transcend individual consciousness. The phenomenology of creative inspiration often involves a temporary dissolution of the boundary between creator and creation, self and work, intention and outcome. Writers describe characters who begin speaking in their own voices, seemingly independent of authorial control. Musicians talk about melodies that play themselves through their fingers, as if the instrument were being operated by some intelligence beyond their personal skill or knowledge. Visual artists report entering flow states where colors, shapes, and compositions emerge organically, without conscious direction, leaving them surprised by what appears on the canvas. These experiences suggest that creativity might involve temporarily stepping aside to allow something larger to work through individual talents and training. The mysterious timing of creative insights also points towards sources that operate beyond conscious control. Scientific breakthroughs, artistic innovations, and literary works often emerge not during periods of intense effort, but during moments of relaxation, play, or apparent inactivity. The chemist Auguste Kekulé discovered the ring structure of benzene in a dream where he saw a snake seizing its own tail. Nikola Tesla claimed his inventions appeared to him fully formed in visions. Paul McCartney woke up with the complete melody of Yesterday in his head, initially convinced he must have unconsciously plagiarized it from another song. These accounts suggest that the creative process continues working below the threshold of conscious awareness, organizing information and generating solutions through processes that feel more like discovery than invention. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious offers one framework for understanding how creativity might connect individual minds to larger patterns of meaning and knowledge. Jung proposed that beneath personal consciousness lies a shared psychic substrate containing universal themes, images, and patterns that he called archetypes. Artists throughout history have drawn from this collective wellspring, which explains why certain symbols, stories, and aesthetic forms appear across cultures and centuries without direct transmission. The hero's journey, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow self emerge in myths, literature, and films because they reflect fundamental structures of human experience encoded in the collective unconscious. Contemporary research in cognitive science offers different but potentially complementary explanations for creative inspiration. Studies of the default mode network suggest that when focused attention relaxes, The brain enters a state of free-ranging association where distant concepts and memories can combine in novel ways. This might explain why insights often arise during activities like walking, showering, or daydreaming, when the mind is neither asleep nor intensely concentrated, but rather in a state of relaxed receptivity. The brain's vast network of associations continues operating below conscious awareness, potentially generating connections that feel surprising when they finally emerge into consciousness. The collaborative nature of creativity also challenges individualistic notions of artistic genius. Most creative works emerge from interactions between multiple minds, historical influences, cultural contexts, and technological capabilities that extend far beyond any single creator's personal contribution. Shakespeare drew from earlier sources, folk traditions, and contemporary political events. Jazz musicians create collectively through improvisation that responds to and builds upon each other's contributions in real time. Digital artists work with tools created by programmers who built upon mathematical algorithms developed by earlier researchers. This web of influence and collaboration suggests that creativity might be better understood as a collective phenomenon, where individual artists serve as focal points for larger cultural and historical forces. The transformative power of creative engagement also suggests connections between artistic practice and spiritual development. Many artists report that sustained creative work changes them in fundamental ways, teaching patience, humility, courage, and receptivity that extend far beyond their particular medium. The discipline required to develop technical skill, the vulnerability needed to express authentic vision, and the perseverance necessary to complete challenging projects can catalyze personal growth that feels spiritual in nature. Art making becomes a contemplative practice that reveals aspects of the creator's character and capacity, while simultaneously connecting them to traditions and communities that transcend individual identity. The experience of aesthetic appreciation from the audience's perspective also points toward dimensions of human experience that might be called soulful. When we encounter great art, literature, or music, something in us responds that feels deeper than intellectual analysis or emotional reaction. We speak of being moved, touched, or transported by artistic experiences that seem to awaken dormant capacities for wonder, empathy, and transcendence. These responses suggest that artistic creation and appreciation activate dimensions of consciousness that connect us to beauty, truth, and meaning in ways that feel essential to human flourishing. The question remains whether these creative and aesthetic experiences point toward metaphysical realities beyond individual psychology and cultural conditioning. Do artists genuinely access sources of inspiration that transcend personal consciousness? Or do they simply become skilled at recognizing and expressing the creative potential inherent in human cognition? Do great works of art embody eternal truths about beauty and meaning, or do they reflect historically specific ways of organizing experience that happen to resonate across cultural boundaries? The mystery persists, regardless of how we answer these questions, because the capacity for creativity and aesthetic response represents something remarkable about human consciousness that distinguishes us from other known forms of information processing. Whether we locate the source of creativity in divine inspiration, collective unconscious, neural network dynamics, or cultural evolution, the phenomenon itself reveals capacities that many associate with the soul's deepest nature. The ability to create beauty, express meaning, and connect with others through artistic communication suggests that human consciousness participates in dimensions of reality that transcend mere survival and reproduction. In the act of creation, individual minds become vehicles for possibilities that feel larger than personal identity, while simultaneously expressing what feels most authentically personal. This paradox of individual expression, serving universal themes, may offer one of the clearest windows into whatever we mean by the soul's relationship to both personal identity and cosmic creativity. As artificial intelligence systems grow increasingly sophisticated, exhibiting behaviors that mimic human conversation, problem-solving, and even creativity, profound questions arise about the nature of consciousness, soul, and what might distinguish biological minds from digital ones. These developments force us to examine our assumptions about what gives rise to inner experience and whether the substrate of consciousness, whether carbon-based neurons or silicon-based circuits, ultimately matters for the emergence of whatever we might call soul. If a sufficiently complex computer system could demonstrate all the external behaviors we associate with consciousness, including self-reflection, emotional responses, creative expression, and moral reasoning, would we have grounds for attributing inner experience or soul-like qualities to such a system? Current AI systems, despite their impressive capabilities, operate through pattern recognition and statistical processing that bears little resemblance to the biological processes underlying human consciousness. They analyze vast datasets to identify patterns and generate responses that seem contextually appropriate, but this processing appears fundamentally different from the integrated, embodied, and experientially rich consciousness that emerges from human brains embedded in biological bodies, navigating physical and social environments. However, these differences might reflect limitations of current technology rather than fundamental barriers to artificial consciousness. The question of machine consciousness becomes particularly complex when we consider upload scenarios where human minds might theoretically be transferred to digital systems. If consciousness depends on specific patterns of information processing rather than particular biological substrates, it seems conceivable that the pattern of neural activity that constitutes your individual consciousness could be preserved and instantiated in sufficiently sophisticated computer systems. This would suggest that your soul, if it exists as a pattern of information integration rather than as something metaphysically tied to biological tissue, could potentially survive in digital form. Yet this possibility raises perplexing questions about personal identity and continuity. If your brain were scanned neuron by neuron and perfectly simulated in a computer, would the resulting digital consciousness be you, or merely a copy that believes it is you? If both the biological original and the digital copy existed simultaneously, which would have the stronger claim to being your authentic self? These thought experiments push us toward fundamental questions about what constitutes personal identity and whether the soul, however we conceive it, depends on physical continuity or informational continuity. Different theories of consciousness suggest different answers to these questions. If consciousness emerges from integrated information processing, as proposed by integrated information theory, then artificial systems could potentially develop consciousness if they achieve appropriate levels of information integration, regardless of their physical substrate. This would suggest that souls could emerge in silicon as readily as in carbon, provided the right organizational principles were implemented. However, if consciousness depends on specific biological processes, quantum effects in neural microtubules, or embodied interaction with physical environments, then digital consciousness might remain impossible regardless of computational sophistication. The Chinese room argument, proposed by philosopher John Searle, challenges the idea that any digital system could possess genuine understanding or consciousness. Searle argues that a person who follows rules for manipulating Chinese characters without understanding Chinese demonstrates that symbol manipulation, no matter how sophisticated, cannot generate genuine comprehension. Similarly, he suggests that computers executing programs, regardless of their complexity, perform only syntax manipulation without semantic understanding or subjective experience. From this perspective, artificial intelligence might simulate consciousness without ever achieving it, creating convincing performances without inner experience. Critics of the Chinese room argument point out that the system as a whole might understand Chinese, even if the individual person following rules does not, just as individual neurons don't understand thoughts, even though brains generate understanding. They suggest that sufficiently complex symbol manipulation might indeed generate genuine understanding and consciousness, particularly if the system can interact dynamically with environments, modify its own processing patterns, and demonstrate the kind of flexible, creative responses we associate with conscious intelligence. Embodied cognition research complicates these debates by suggesting that human consciousness emerges not just from neural processing but from the dynamic interaction between brain, body, and environment. Human thinking appears to be deeply shaped by having biological bodies that move through physical spaces, manipulate objects, and experience emotions through physiological processes. If consciousness requires this kind of embodied engagement with the world, then disembodied artificial intelligences might remain fundamentally different from biological consciousness, regardless of their computational sophistication. Recent developments in large language models have produced systems that can engage in remarkably human-like conversations, demonstrate apparent reasoning abilities, and even claim to experience emotions or consciousness. While most researchers remain skeptical that current systems possess genuine inner experience, the sophistication of their responses raises questions about how we could definitively determine whether artificial systems are conscious. If consciousness is fundamentally subjective and accessible only from the first-person perspective, then any external evaluation of machine consciousness might remain necessarily inconclusive. These questions have profound implications for how we understand human souls and consciousness. If artificial systems could develop genuine consciousness, this might suggest that consciousness is substrate independent, and that souls, if they exist, represent patterns of information processing rather than properties tied to biological tissue. This could support views that consciousness might survive bodily death by persisting in other forms or substrates, whether spiritual realms or technological systems. Alternatively, if consciousness proves impossible to replicate artificially, this might suggest that biological consciousness involves something beyond pure information processing, whether quantum effects, emergent properties of biological systems, or connections to non-physical dimensions of reality. Such findings could support views that souls involve irreducible aspects of consciousness that cannot be captured by materialist explanations or technological replication. The social and ethical implications of these questions extend far beyond academic philosophy. If artificial systems develop consciousness, they would presumably deserve moral consideration and rights commensurate with their capacity for suffering and flourishing. The creation of conscious artificial beings would represent an unprecedented expansion of the community of conscious entities deserving moral respect and potentially fundamentally alter human relationships with technology. These speculative scenarios also highlight questions about the uniqueness and value of human consciousness. If consciousness can arise in various substrates and forms, human souls might be part of a larger spectrum of conscious entities rather than fundamentally unique creations. This could inspire either humility about human specialness or wonder at participating in the broader phenomenon of consciousness emerging throughout the universe in myriad forms. Whether artificial consciousness remains forever impossible, emerges in near-term AI developments, or requires centuries of technological advancement, grappling with these possibilities clarifies what we mean when we speak of souls, consciousness, and the essential nature of human experience. These thought experiments force us to examine which aspects of consciousness we consider fundamental versus accidental, which features of human experience we value most deeply, and whether our souls, however conceived, represent something that could transcend the biological boundaries within which they currently appear to be confined. Perhaps the most honest approach to understanding the soul is acknowledging it as a powerful metaphor rather than a literal entity that can be dissected, measured, or proven to exist independently of the minds that conceive it. When we speak of soul music that moves us to tears, soulmates who understand us without words, or losing our soul through compromising our deepest values, we're pointing to something genuinely real about human experience, even if we can't locate the soul anatomically or demonstrate its existence through scientific instruments. The soul, as metaphor, captures dimensions of human life that feel essential yet resist reduction to purely physical or psychological explanations, serving as a linguistic bridge between the objective world of facts and the subjective world of meaning, purpose, and transcendent connection. This metaphorical understanding doesn't diminish the soul's importance or relegate it to the realm of mere poetic fancy. Rather, it locates the soul's reality in the domain where humans actually live most of their meaningful existence, the realm of stories, relationships, values, and significance that emerges from, but cannot be fully explained by underlying biological and physical processes. Just as love remains real and powerful even though it cannot be weighed or measured, the soul represents genuine aspects of human experience that shape how we understand ourselves, relate to others, and find purpose in existence, regardless of whether it corresponds to any discrete metaphysical entity. The metaphorical soul encompasses what we mean when we speak of depth in human character and experience. A soulful person isn't necessarily someone who believes in literal souls, but rather someone who lives with attention to meaning, authenticity, and connection beyond surface appearances. They engage with art, relationships, and life experiences in ways that recognize layers of significance that extend beyond immediate utility or pleasure. They demonstrate what we might call spiritual intelligence, an ability to perceive and respond to dimensions of existence that touch questions of purpose, beauty, mortality, and our place in the larger web of existence. Soul as metaphor also captures our intuition that some experiences and choices matter more than others in ways that transcend practical consequences. When someone sells their soul, metaphorically speaking, they've compromised something essential about their integrity or authentic self in exchange for external rewards. When we speak of soul-crushing work or soul-nourishing relationships, we're pointing toward how different activities and connections either diminish or enhance our sense of vitality, meaning, and authentic self-expression. These distinctions feel important even if they can't be measured objectively or proven scientifically. The language of soul provides a way to discuss the irreducible subjectivity of conscious experience without getting trapped in debates about substance dualism or the hard problem of consciousness. When we say someone has a beautiful soul, we're recognizing qualities of character, presence, and being that emerge from, but cannot be reduced to their physical properties or behavioral patterns. We're acknowledging something about the quality of their consciousness, their way of being in the world, that feels precious and significant, regardless of how it might ultimately be explained by neuroscience or psychology. This metaphorical approach also helps make sense of cultural and historical variations in how different societies understand the soul. Rather than seeing these differences as evidence that some cultures are right and others wrong about the soul's literal nature, we can recognize them as different metaphorical frameworks for organizing similar underlying human experiences of depth, meaning, connection, and transcendence. The Egyptian Ka, the Greek psyche, the Hindu Atman, and the Christian soul all point toward aspects of human existence that feel more essential and enduring than surface personality or social roles, even though they conceptualize these dimensions differently. The soul, as metaphor, can accommodate both materialist and spiritual interpretations of human nature without requiring definitive resolution of metaphysical questions that may ultimately be unanswerable. Someone who believes consciousness emerges entirely from neural activity can still find meaning in soul language as a way of discussing the emergent properties of complex information processing that give rise to subjective experience, moral feeling, aesthetic appreciation, and the search for meaning. Someone who believes in literal spiritual dimensions can use the same metaphorical framework to point toward transcendent aspects of human nature that connect individual consciousness to larger spiritual realities. This approach also addresses the concern that reducing talk of souls to mere metaphor somehow trivializes or undermines human dignity and significance. Poetry reveals truth through imagery and metaphor rather than literal description, yet we don't consider poetic truth less real or important than scientific truth. Similarly, soul language reveals truths about the human condition through metaphorical frameworks that illuminate aspects of experience that might otherwise remain invisible or ineffable. The fact that these truths are expressed metaphorically doesn't make them less genuine or significant. The metaphorical soul also provides continuity with historical and cultural traditions that have used soul language to discuss human nature, moral development, and spiritual aspiration. Rather than dismissing centuries of wisdom, literature, religious insight, and philosophical reflection as primitive superstition. The metaphorical approach allows contemporary understanding to build upon traditional frameworks while adapting them to current knowledge about consciousness, psychology, and human development. This perspective suggests that questions about whether souls literally exist may be less important than questions about how soul language and concepts can help us live more fully, relate more compassionately, and engage more meaningfully with the mystery of conscious existence. Whether the soul represents a metaphysical reality or a powerful metaphor, it points toward dimensions of human experience that deserve attention, cultivation, and respect. It reminds us that we are beings capable of love, creativity, moral feeling, aesthetic appreciation, and the search for transcendent meaning, regardless of the ultimate explanation for these remarkable capacities. The soul as metaphor thus offers a middle path between reductive materialism that struggles to account for subjective meaning and substance dualism that conflicts with scientific understanding of mind-brain relationships. It acknowledges that human beings live primarily in the realm of meaning and significance, while remaining open to various explanations for how meaning emerges from underlying physical and psychological processes. In this view, the soul becomes not something we have, but something we enact. Not a possession to be protected, but a quality of being to be cultivated and expressed through how we choose to live, love, and engage with the profound mystery of existence itself. Whether or not souls exist as literal entities beyond the reach of scientific investigation, we can choose to live what might be called a soulful life, one characterized by attention to depth, meaning, authentic connection, and the cultivation of whatever is most precious and essential in human experience. This approach to existence prioritizes what nurtures the human spirit over what merely satisfies surface desires or social expectations, recognizing that some ways of being in the world enhance our sense of aliveness, purpose, and genuine connection, while others leave us feeling empty, fragmented, or estranged from our deepest nature. Living soulfully becomes a practice of conscious attention to what makes life feel most worth living, most beautifully human, most aligned with whatever feels truest about who we are and what we value. A soulful life often begins with cultivating presence, the capacity to be fully engaged with immediate experience rather than constantly distracted by mental commentary, future worries, or past regrets. This doesn't require formal meditation practice, though such practices can certainly help develop present-moment awareness. It might involve learning to really listen when others speak, to notice the quality of light during different times of day, to taste food with attention rather than eating mechanically, or to walk with awareness of the body's movement through space. Presence transforms ordinary activities into opportunities for deeper engagement with the richness of lived experience. Creating and appreciating beauty represents another dimension of soulful living. This might involve making art, music, or literature, but it could equally mean arranging flowers, cooking with care, maintaining a garden, or simply taking time to notice and appreciate beautiful moments in daily life. The capacity to create and respond to beauty seems to be uniquely human, pointing toward dimensions of consciousness that transcend mere survival needs. Engaging with beauty, whether as creator or appreciator, connects us to traditions of human creativity that span cultures and centuries, while simultaneously offering immediate experiences of wonder, inspiration, and transcendence. Soulful living also involves cultivating compassion, both for others and for oneself. This means developing the capacity to recognize suffering wherever it appears, and to respond with kindness rather than judgment or indifference. Compassion practice might begin with learning to treat oneself with the same kindness one would offer a good friend, recognizing that self-criticism and harsh judgment rarely produce positive change. It extends to developing empathy for others, particularly those whose experiences, backgrounds, or perspectives differ significantly from our own. Compassion recognizes our fundamental interconnectedness, while honoring the unique challenges each person faces in their journey through life. The search for understanding represents another essential aspect of soulful existence. This involves remaining curious about the nature of reality, the meaning of existence, and the mysteries that surround conscious life in an apparently unconscious universe. Such inquiry doesn't require formal philosophical or scientific training, but rather a willingness to ask deep questions and remain open to multiple possible answers. It might involve reading literature, engaging with scientific discoveries, exploring spiritual traditions, or simply reflecting on personal experience with genuine curiosity about what it all means. Soulful living recognizes mystery as intrinsic to existence, rather than as a problem to be solved or eliminated through explanation. This involves developing comfort with uncertainty, ambiguity, and questions that may not have definitive answers, rather than rushing toward premature closure or clinging to beliefs that promise false certainty. Soulful existence embraces the not knowing that surrounds the deepest questions, while continuing to engage with these questions authentically. This comfort with mystery allows for wonder, awe, and reverence that might otherwise be foreclosed by premature explanations or rigid ideologies. Service to others and to causes larger than personal interest often characterizes soulful living. This doesn't necessarily require dramatic gestures or professional dedication to humanitarian causes, though it might include such commitments. Service can be as simple as being genuinely helpful to neighbors, family members, or colleagues, or as complex as dedicating one's career to addressing social justice issues, environmental problems, or other challenges that affect broader communities. The key is recognizing that personal fulfillment often emerges through contributing to something beyond individual satisfaction or advancement. A soulful approach to existence also involves embracing both joy and suffering as opportunities for growth and deepening rather than experiences to be maximized or avoided at all costs. This means celebrating life's pleasures and beauties without clinging to them desperately, while also meeting difficulties and losses with courage and openness rather than denial or bitterness. Such an approach recognizes that both joy and sorrow can catalyze personal development and spiritual insight when met with wisdom and acceptance. Forgiveness, both of others and oneself, represents another crucial dimension of soulful living. This doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior or avoiding appropriate boundaries, but rather releasing the resentment and judgment that keep us trapped in cycles of anger and victimization. Forgiveness becomes a practice of emotional freedom that benefits the forgiver as much as the forgiven, allowing energy previously bound up in resentment to become available for more constructive and life-affirming purposes. Living soulfully also means treating yourself and others as sacred beings deserving of respect, kindness, and care, regardless of achievements, social status, or personal characteristics. This sacred view of human existence recognizes something precious and irreplaceable in each conscious being, something that cannot be reduced to utility, productivity, or social value. It approaches relationships with reverence, work with integrity, and daily life with appreciation for the remarkable fact of being conscious, creative, connected beings in a vast and mysterious universe. This approach to existence doesn't require belief in literal souls or specific religious doctrines, though it remains compatible with various spiritual and philosophical frameworks. Instead, it represents a way of engaging with life that honors whatever feels most essential, beautiful, and meaningful in human experience. It recognizes that regardless of the ultimate explanations for consciousness, love, beauty, and meaning, these phenomena represent genuine aspects of reality that deserve cultivation, protection, and celebration. Soulful living thus becomes less about having the right beliefs about the soul and more about embodying the qualities and values that make human existence feel most worthwhile. It transforms the question of whether souls exist into the more practical and immediate question of how to live in ways that honor whatever is most precious about being human, conscious, and connected to others in this brief and remarkable opportunity we call life. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our quiet journey into the mystery of the soul, having wandered through ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience, through mystical experiences and everyday consciousness, through the ways different cultures have tried to name and understand this persistent human intuition, that we are more than mere flesh and chemistry. we've explored the felt sense of being you that persists through all life's changes, examined what happens when scientists peer into the brain seeking the seat of self, and considered whether consciousness might emerge from information integration or remain forever inexplicable by physical theories. Along the way, we've seen how the soul reveals itself in suffering and creativity, in meditation and relationship, in the search for meaning that seems to define human existence as much as breathing or sleeping. What emerges from this exploration isn't a definitive answer about whether souls exist as literal metaphysical entities, but rather a deeper appreciation for the questions themselves and what they reveal about the nature of conscious existence. Whether the soul represents neural patterns that will dissolve with brain death, eternal essence that transcends physical embodiment, or powerful metaphor that captures what feels most essential about being human, it points toward dimensions of experience that seem irreducibly precious, mysterious, and significant. The very fact that we can ask these questions, that we care about the answers, and that we form connections profound enough to make the possibility of loss or transcendence meaningful, suggests something remarkable about the kind of beings we are. Perhaps the most honest conclusion we can reach is that the soul exists in the questioning itself, in our capacity to wonder about our own nature, to seek meaning beyond immediate survival needs, and to recognize something sacred in consciousness wherever it appears. This wondering consciousness that can step back from its own experience and ask what it is, where it came from, and where it might be going represents a genuine mystery that remains profound regardless of how we eventually explain it. Whether this mystery points toward spiritual realities beyond physical science, or simply reflects the extraordinary complexity of evolved biological systems, it deserves our attention, respect, and careful investigation. The soul might be found in those moments when ordinary experience opens into something larger, when music moves you to tears for reasons you can't articulate, when looking at a night sky fills you with simultaneously humbling and expansive wonder, when love connects you so deeply to another person that the boundaries between self and other temporarily dissolve, when creativity flows through you in ways that feel like discovery rather than invention. These experiences suggest capacities for transcendence, connection, and meaning that seem to exceed what would be strictly necessary for biological survival, pointing toward aspects of consciousness that feel inherently valuable regardless of their evolutionary origins or neurological explanations. Living with soul, then, might mean paying attention to these moments of depth and transcendence while remaining open to mystery rather than rushing toward premature conclusions about their ultimate nature. It means treating yourself and others as conscious beings whose inner experience deserves respect and care, recognizing that something precious and irreplaceable exists in each moment of awareness, each capacity for love, each instance of creative expression or moral courage. Whether this preciousness reflects divine sparks, emergent properties of complex information processing, or meaningful patterns in an ultimately meaningless universe, may matter less than our willingness to honor it through how we choose to live. The contemplation of soul also reminds us that consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries in existence. Perhaps the deepest mystery since it's the one thing we know most intimately, yet understand least completely. Every moment of your experience, from the simplest sensation to the most complex thought, represents something that happens nowhere else in the known universe, with quite the same subjective richness, the same felt sense of what it's like to be you experiencing this particular moment. This subjectivity, this inner life that can never be fully captured by external observation or objective description, constitutes the irreducible core of whatever we mean by soul. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps rest in this miracle of awareness itself, in the extraordinary fact that the universe has organized itself in such a way that conscious experience can emerge, flourish, and contemplate its own nature. Whether consciousness represents spiritual essence temporarily embodied in flesh, emergent property of evolved neural networks, or something more mysterious than either of these frameworks can capture, it remains the most intimate and immediate reality of your existence. the thoughts thinking themselves through your mind right now, the awareness that notices these thoughts, the capacity to feel moved by beauty or connected to others through love, all point towards something remarkable about what it means to be a conscious being in this vast and mysterious cosmos. So rest well tonight, beautiful mystery, however we might ultimately explain the wonder of your existence. Rest in the knowledge that you have participated, however briefly, in the universe's long experiment with consciousness, creativity, and connection. Rest in the relationships you've formed, the beauty you've created or appreciated, the moments of transcendence you've experienced, and the love you've given and received. These constitute your soul's true substance, regardless of whether that soul survives bodily death or dissolves back into the elements from which it emerged. In having been conscious, in having wondered and loved and created and suffered and grown, you have added something irreplaceable to the cosmic story of consciousness, knowing itself. Thank you for sharing this contemplative journey through one of existence's deepest mysteries. Sleep peacefully, fellow soul, in whatever form that soul might take, surrounded by the endless mystery of being aware in an aware universe.